I'm 86 years old, and what I know about the human heart would shock most cardiologists into silence, not because it's complicated, but because it's so obvious, and we spent decades ignoring it completely. The heart is not fragile. That's the first thing you need to understand. The heart is the most resilient muscle in your body. It beats 100,000 times a day without you asking it to. It has been doing that since before you were born. The heart does not fail because it is weak. The heart fails because we poison it slowly, methodically, one meal at a time for decades, and we do it while believing we are simply living normally. I turned 40 and I had already buried two friends, both men, both gone before 55, and both of them ate the way I ate. That was the moment I stopped looking at food as pleasure and started looking at it as chemistry. Because that's what it is. Every single thing you put in your body creates a chemical reaction. And some of those reactions, repeated daily for years, quietly dismantle the architecture of your cardiovascular system from the inside out. The first thing I stopped eating was refined sugar. And I do not mean I cut back, I mean I stopped. Because here is what most people do not know about sugar and the heart. It is not just about calories, and it is not just about diabetes. Refined sugar triggers chronic inflammation, and inflammation is the root mechanism behind arterial plaque formation. When you eat sugar, your body spikes insulin, triglycerides rise, HDL cholesterol drops, and the lining of your arteries, the endothelium, begins to suffer micro damage. That damage is the invitation. Plaque is just the body's attempt to patch what sugar keeps tearing open. I did not know that at 40. I learned it the hard way by watching men my age collapse. The science had known it for years. We just weren't told. But it goes deeper than that. The relationship between sugar and the heart is not just mechanical, it is hormonal. Fructose, specifically the kind found in high fructose corn syrup and processed foods, is metabolized almost entirely in the liver. It does not trigger satiety signals the way glucose does. You can consume enormous quantities of fructose, and your brain never registers fullness. Meanwhile, your liver converts it to fat, ships it into your bloodstream as VLDL particles, and those particles batter the walls of your coronary arteries for years before any symptom appears. The first symptom, for too many people, is a heart attack. By the time you feel it, the damage is already a decade old. The second thing I eliminated was refined seed oils, vegetable oil, canola oil, soybean oil, corn oil. These became the foundation of the modern diet starting in the 1960s, and their introduction coincides precisely with the explosion of cardiovascular disease in the developed world. These oils are extraordinarily high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. The human body requires a balance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, ideally somewhere near 1 to 1, at most 4 to 1. The modern industrial diet delivers a ratio closer to 20 to 1, sometimes higher. That imbalance is not neutral. Excess omega-6 drives the production of pro-inflammatory eicosanoids, chemical messengers that keep your body in a persistent low-grade inflammatory state. And what does chronic inflammation do? It damages the arterial wall, it invites the formation of plaque, it raises blood pressure, it stiffens vessels that should remain flexible. I stopped cooking with those oils at 40 and never looked back. And here is what most people miss when they talk about oils. It is not just about what you cook with at home. It is about everything processed, packaged, and fried. Restaurant food, crackers, margarine, salad dressing, frozen meals. These oils are in everything because they are cheap and they have a long shelf life. When you commit to eliminating them, you are essentially committing to eating real food, which turns out to be the point. The third thing I stopped was processed meat. Not all meat, processed meat. Deli cuts, hot dogs, sausages, packaged bacon with nitrate preservatives. The sodium content alone in these products is enough to raise blood pressure chronically over years. But the deeper issue is the nitrates used to cure and preserve the meat. In the digestive system, nitrates convert to nitrosamines, compounds that damage blood vessel walls at the cellular level, promote oxidative stress, and have been consistently linked in study after study to elevated cardiovascular mortality. I was eating these things nearly every day at 35, and I thought they were just convenient. They were convenient, yes, and they were quietly doing damage I could not see or feel. The fourth food I removed from my life was white bread and white flour in all its forms. Not because of gluten, which is a conversation that has been badly muddied by marketing, but because refined flour is, metabolically speaking, nearly identical to pure sugar. It spikes blood glucose rapidly. It triggers the same insulin response, the same triglyceride cascade, the same inflammatory process. The fiber has been removed, the nutrients have been stripped. What remains is a substance that your body processes like candy: white bread, white rice, white pasta. These are not foods that build a resilient cardiovascular system. They are foods that slowly eroded meal after meal, decade after decade. And the real power in understanding this is recognizing that these foods were engineered to be addictive. The rapid blood sugar spike produces a brief neurological reward. Your brain learns to associate the food with pleasure. The crash that follows produces cravings. You reach for more. The cycle repeats. This is not weakness of character. This is neurobiology. The food does what it was designed to do. Understanding that gave me the freedom to step outside the cycle without self-judgment. I was not failing at discipline. I was responding to chemistry. Once I changed the chemistry, the cravings disappeared within weeks. The fifth thing I stopped was excessive alcohol. I'm not speaking to anyone's pleasure or moral choices here. I'm speaking to cardiovascular chemistry. What most people are told is that moderate red wine is heart protective. There is some evidence for the polyphenols in red wine, yes, but the alcohol itself is a different story. Alcohol raises blood pressure. Chronically elevated blood pressure is the single most significant modifiable risk factor for heart attack and stroke. Alcohol disrupts sleep architecture, and poor sleep has been directly linked to elevated cortisol, arterial stiffness, and inflammatory markers. Alcohol also damages the liver's ability to process and clear LDL cholesterol from the bloodstream. I was not a heavy drinker. I drank the way most social people drink. But at 40, I looked at those mechanisms clearly and made a choice. The sixth and final thing I eliminated was the category I call invisible sodium. Not the salt you add to food, but the salt already packed into everything processed, canned, and packaged. The average processed meal contains more than a full day's worth of sodium before you add anything. Sodium at chronically elevated intake drives fluid retention, increases blood volume, and forces the heart to pump harder against greater resistance. Over years, the left ventricle thickens, the walls of your arteries stiffen, blood pressure rises and stays elevated. This is called hypertension, and half the people who have it do not know it. They feel fine until they do not. When I stopped eating processed food, my blood pressure dropped more than 20 points within 3 months without any medication change. My doctor stood in the doorway of the exam room and looked at me like I had performed a miracle. I had not performed anything. I had simply stopped poisoning a system that wanted to be well. Here is the deeper principle underneath all of this, and I want you to hold it carefully. The heart does not ask for much. It asks for clean fuel. It asks for blood that flows freely through vessels that remain supple and unobstructed. Every one of the 6 things I described works against those 2 conditions. They inflame, they stiffen, they clog, they spike and crash and spike again. And they do it so gradually that most people never connect the cause to the effect. They get a diagnosis at 55 or 62, and they think it came from nowhere. It did not come from nowhere. It came from 30 years of breakfast and lunch and dinner. There is something else that connects all 6 of these foods, something that runs beneath the surface of each individual mechanism, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every single one of them, the refined sugar, the seed oils, the processed meats, the white flour, the alcohol, the invisible sodium, every single one of them is the product of industrial food manufacturing. None of them exist in nature in the form we consume them. High fructose corn syrup does not grow on a plant. Canola oil does not flow from a spring. Hot dogs are not an animal that walks the earth. These are engineered products, designed by companies whose primary interest is shelf life, palatability, and profit. The human cardiovascular system was not part of the design brief. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply a consequence of incentives. Cheap ingredients, long shelf life, and maximum flavor response equal maximum sales. The fact that those same properties cause arterial inflammation and hypertension was not the manufacturer's concern. And for decades, the medical establishment was too focused on cholesterol, specifically LDL cholesterol, to follow the thread back to inflammation as the root cause. Cholesterol was measurable, manageable, and profitable to treat with statins. Telling people to stop eating processed food was not a billable intervention. So the conversation stayed narrow for too long. The science changed. The understanding of the endothelium, the single-cell thick lining inside every blood vessel in your body, changed the entire picture. When researchers began to understand how endothelial dysfunction worked, how the lining of arteries could be damaged by oxidative stress, by chronic glucose spikes, by omega 6 excess, by nitrosamines, by cortisol. Suddenly, the six foods I eliminated were no longer just dietary preferences. They were mechanisms, measurable, documented mechanisms of arterial destruction. And what protects the endothelium turned out to be almost entirely the absence of those things, combined with the presence of real food: vegetables, fruit, legumes, whole grains, fish, olive oil, nuts, foods that have traveled with the human cardiovascular system for hundreds of thousands of years. The practical application is simpler than it sounds. You do not need a special diet. You do not need supplements or protocols or expensive programs. You need to look carefully at the ingredient label of everything you eat and ask three direct questions. Does this contain refined sugar or high fructose corn syrup? Does this contain refined seed oils? Does this contain excessive sodium or processed preservatives? If the answer to any of those is yes, you make a different choice. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently, deliberately, over time. I am 86 years old. My heart is strong. My blood pressure is the blood pressure of a much younger man. I have outlived friends who were more disciplined than me in every other area of life but this one. Food is chemistry. Your heart is responding to that chemistry every single day. The only question is whether you want to understand what you're asking it to respond to. It is never too late to change the chemistry. But the earlier you begin, the more of the damage you prevent before it becomes permanently written into the walls of your arteries. I begin at 40. You're reading this right now. That means you can begin today, not tomorrow, not after the next holiday or the next season or the next year. The chemistry starts changing the moment you change what you put in your body. The heart responds faster than most people expect. Inflammation markers drop within weeks. Blood pressure shifts within months. The body is not holding grudges. It is simply responding to what you give it. Give it something different, and it will respond differently. That is the most important thing I have learned in 86 years of living inside this body. The heart wants to survive. Help it.